Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English, and we turn now in our study of Dante's Inferno to the famous Canto 15, and 15 and 16 together, taken collectively, very controversial. We're in the seventh circle, the third ring. What Dante calls violent against nature, and the word often associated, although not even used in Canto 15, is the term sodomy. We, of course, will mean here homosexuality as well as any other kind of sex act that would be something other than intended for procreation. Now, without question, as I've said, Canto 15 and 16 are some of the most controversial. And I know already some of you have made the observation, look, which direction are we going to go here, for or against? And because of the nature of our work in 303, what I want to do is I want to be able to present information to you in a respectful way so that both sides of the debate will feel that we have properly represented the position, and then I leave to you the decisions about how gracefully or poetically Dante will take care of this type of topic. I think it's important, though, that we are respectful of alternate views. But we will note, right, today, for example, how many of the sins seen in Inferno so far in our study together are still considered sins. I mean, think about this. Do we consider, for example, being uncommitted a sin? Being an adulterer a sin? Some will say yes, some will say no. How about this one, being a glutton a sin? We normally don't think of it that way. We think of it, let's get somebody some help. Being a prodigal that spends all your money, or very, very avaricious. We don't normally think of those as sins, right? Maybe faults, but not sins worthy of eternal damnation. The wrathful and the sullen, well, we normally think of people that have anger management issues. We got to get them some help. And then people who are sullen are often, for us, depressed. Heretics, do we think in those terms anymore? Maybe. Now, for sure, murderers we continue to think of as being people worthy of torment and of some kind in the afterlife, especially if it's, a really terrible situation. What about suicides? How do we think about that? We see it as tragic. Do we see it as sin? And, of course, blasphemers. Do we even think in those terms as much anymore? And now we come to the last two of Circle 7, the sodomites, those who engage in homosexual behavior, and the usurers, that is to say, they let money make money, which today is not even considered bad at all, and yet, for Dante, considered actually worse than the act of homosexuality, right? The address, then, that we're attempting here, it's a difficult topic, no question. Well, we want to do it with respect, and we want to do it honestly. And we want to ask, obviously, this is a question that so many of you have asked me. Why is it that the church ever cared at all about what a person does with his or her body, especially in sexual ways? Like, what is up with that? And I think there is, if I can help you get there, I'm not saying you're going to agree with this position. I'm just saying try and think it through. If, for example, you began with a premise that sex, or the act of copulation, is for procreation, making children, and not for enjoyment. That is to say, having sex for enjoyment is not what we're about, but rather having sex for propagation of the species. If you begin from that position, then the only natural form of sexual activity is that which produces children. Anything other than that would be constituted for Dante as some notion of unnatural, violence against nature. Now maybe you can understand. By the way, that means we're not just talking about homosexual activity. We can talk about heterosexual activity that would not be specifically for procreative purposes. It would immediately be labeled as something malign, something wrong, something not correct. Now, the key here is not that loving another, in the case of Dante, loving another man, right, if you are a man, is in itself wrong. It's not that. It's rather more about the physical act that would, in some kind of active sex act or whatever. The argument, again, is any kind of action that would be sexual that doesn't promote procreative purposes would be constituted then as unnatural and therefore wrong, going against God's intended plan. Now, obviously, times have changed. I mean, just think about this for a moment. In Dante's Inferno, usury is actually placed as a worse sin than even sodomy. And yet today, of course, pretty much everybody accepts usury as the way we do business in the world. So let's go ahead now and enjoy the discussion. We're not going to shy away from the discussion, but right away we are going to point out the ironies that while Dante will talk about sodomy in the abstract, the word itself is not even mentioned. We're going to get to another interesting talking point here in a bit. Let's just do some quick review work here. If you haven't been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net, I hope that you go there, find the AP folder. I'm assuming that you've worked with me from the Iliad all the way up through St. Augustine's Confessions. St. Augustine, who of course had a thing or two to say about sex because he himself, as he admits in Confessions, he himself was a sex addict for much of his life before he had his conversion experience, right? We have already given lectures on the first 14 cantos. Let's go through them quickly just to remind where we've been. In Canto 1, Lost in a Dark Wood, 7th of April, 1300, Dante, 35 years old. He needs help. Virgil shows up. In Canto 2, Virgil will tell him, Beatrice has sent me, that's why I'm here. In Canto 3, they enter the inscription of Hell abandon, hope all ye who enter here. Cantos 5, 6, and 7 tell us about circles 2, 3, 4, and 5. The incontinent, that is to say, not strong enough will. In circle 2, the jacked lovers and Francesca. In circle 3, the gluttons. In circle 4, the prodigals and avaricious, as well as in circle 5, the river Styx, the wrathful and the sullen. In Canto 8, we have Filippi Argenti, and then finally we're at the walls of Dis, the city of Satan. In Canto 9, the gates of Dis are open. In Canto 10, that famous conversation Dante has with Fra Renata and Cavalcante. In Canto 11, we have Virgil giving that map layout of the entire territory, where we hear about, for example, this area that will, and he mentions that the famous story from the Bible in Genesis about Sodom and Gomorrah, and that's where our word sodomy actually derives and all of that. We then will begin with the violent. In Canto 12, Circle 7, Round 1, we have the violent against neighbors, right? And this is the famous river of blood. In Canto 13, we have Round 2 of Circle 7, violent against self, that's the suicides. In Canto 14, we have the third ring, and that is the violent against God, the blasphemers. And here Capernaum was mentioned there. And now we come to Canto 15. Now again, the hope is that you're reading on your own and using me. Our learning theory is challenging us in our annotative process to ask, first of all, what does the text say? Second of all, what does the text mean? At 2A, messages, themes. At 2B, we're looking at symbolism and irony, and Dante as poet, politician, and philosopher. And finally, at level 3, how can I relate this information to the Iliad and all the other texts we've studied in AP? And finally, how can I relate it to myself? A brief summary of Canto 15, Dante the Pilgrim will actually meet his mentor, Brunetta Lantini, and this is an important moment because they have an interesting exchange. This is a fond exchange, not a negative exchange at all, which is going to provide us with all kinds of amazing irony and some tension as well as we go through it. Let's go ahead now and just turn to Canto 15. We have just finished with now the previous Canto 14. So now we're told the firm margin bears us because they're leaving that area of the violent against God, the blasphemers. Under the vapor rising from the stream to form a shade and fend the fire off, sheltering both banks and water. And then we get an interesting simile, which will reference some place sites, which actually, some scholars have pointed out, actually did have some resonances of cities that were known to be sexually deviant within the understandings for Dante and medieval Christians. As Flemings between Wissant and Bruges, to defend against the tide that rushes in on them, construct a bulwark to drive the sea from land, and Pandernus on the Brenta do to stem the water and protect their castle and town. Before, Carantina feels the heat, and in the same manner those banks were made, except the one who built them did not make them as high or thick, whoever he was. And I would not have seen the wood that lay behind us, had I looked back. When we encountered another troop of souls, these will be the homosexuals now, never mentioned specifically as that by Dante in this canto, or the one to follow. Another troop of souls who looked at us the way that men will look at one another at dusk when daylight fails under a new moon. And then we get a second rendering, a word picture of what they look like as they look at him, knitting their brows at us the way old tailors do when threading needles. It's a very interesting poetic word picture. While I was being examined by them thus, one recognized me. By the way, we'll come back to this line of one recognized me in our T.S. Eliot study later. One recognized me and took me by the hem, because Dante is up there kind of lower down, so he reaches up and grabs him by his garment, crying, "Why, what a marvel!" I fixed my eyes on his scorched face as he reached out his arm, and the baked features I saw did not forestall my knowing him. I reached back down to him, my hand toward his face. This is a very gentle, this is an interesting, we're going to have an interesting tension that we will talk about a little bit later, but notice how Dante the Pilgrim is treating this individual. By the way, just for your notes, this is Brunetto Latini, who lives from 1212 to 1294. He is not Dante's teacher, although some have thought that. He's not. He's maybe more of an advisor, or really probably more like a mentor. He is a writer and also a politician. Think Dante here. We have absolutely, scholars have told us, no external evidence that Latini was ever homosexual or was gay. None at all. All right? So we're going to have this interesting tension, where Dante the poet will put this man who Dante himself had tremendous respect for in this circle of hell, in this circle of Inferno. And of course, there's a lot of terrible shame that's associated with this. And then Dante the Pilgrim will show Latini tremendous respect for being, along with Farinata, the only two in all of Inferno that he treats with such linguistic respect. Are you here, Sir Brunetto? He replied. My son, may it not displease you if a while Brunetto Latini turns back to walk instead with you a little and lets the train go on. In other words, he says, I want to talk with you if that's okay. I beg it of you with all my heart, I said. And should you prefer that you and I sit down if it pleases him with whom I go, I will. He said, if any of this flock, O son, stops even for an instant, he must lie still 100 years, not brushing off the fire that strikes him. You'll remember that fire is a part of this circle 7. And if we sit down or stop it all, then for 100 years we have to sit here and just take this fire without brushing it off. So in other words, I cannot stop at all. Go then, he says, I'll follow at your heel, and then rejoin my band who walk in a choir, lamenting their eternal woes. Afraid to step down to his level from where we were, I bent my head as in reverence. He said, what destiny or fortune makes you come beyond your final day? And who is this guide? In the bright light above, I answered him. I came into the valley and lost my way. Before my age had reached its ripening time, I turned my back on the place but yesterday. In other words, it was just yesterday that I was outside, lost in a dark wood. He appeared to me at dawn, talking about Virgil. By the way, put this in your notes. Virgil and Dante's, they never mention each other's names throughout their entire journey. It's always in these kind of pronouns or referencing, right? He appeared to me at dawn when I had turned to go back down. And this path is the way by which he leads me home. It's an interesting idea. In other words, I'm going through this experience of going through this journey, but I know ultimately I'm going to find my way back home. Then he returned, Latini. If you keep navigating by your star, now we're going to get an interesting prophecy here from someone Dante respects, who will say to him, keep it up, my boy. If you keep navigating by your star, you'll find a glorious port, if I discerned well in the fair life. Had my years been more, so I could witness how heaven has been kind to you, I would have wished your work good cheer. Wow, this is an interesting exchange. Notice that Latini will say, I'm so sad that I died before I got to see you become famous. And now you're going to be famous. It's so exciting to watch this all happen. Notice, this is an interesting dynamic if this individual has been placed in a circle of hell for his sexual promiscuities, as Dante would understand it, okay? He says, but that ungrateful, malignant folk who descend from those brought down from Fiesole long ago, and who still smack of mountains and rocky ground, will make themselves for good things that you do your enemies. Two observations. First, the history of Florence is a fascinating one. Julius Caesar apparently conquers it, and after the Romans conquered this place of Fiesole, the citizens are then divided into two groups. The Romans being the aristocracy and fewer, and then the rest of them, the Fielci, are the rest, and they're always looked down on. And for that, notice here, Latini will say, the better you are, the more your people of Florence are going to hate you. Political Dante obviously having his fun here, right? They'll make you, for good things that you do, they will make themselves your enemies. And there is reason in that. Among the bitter sort trees, it seems, undo when the sweet fig in season comes to fruit. The world's old saying is that they are blind. In the medieval period, there was a notion of blind as a Florentine, and so Dante is simply playing this game. And what is it that he says about his own people? It's interesting that while this is supposedly a canto about promiscuous sexual activity, we have none of that here at all. We just simply find out that that's in fact who these people are, that they are in fact sodomites. But there's nothing against the activity. It's rather more an exchange about politics, Florentine politics. And he says about the Florentines, a people greedy, envious, proud. Notice your threes. See fit to cleanse their habits from yourself. Don't be like the people who you came from. You'll find your fortune holds such honor as will induce one party and the other to contend in hunger to consume you. This is, of course, a prophecy that ultimately the Dante, the poet, already knows has come true because he's writing in exile. Then the grass will be kept at a distance from the goat. Latini, the poet that he is, loves to have these little sayings. The grass will be kept at a distance from the goat. In other words, they're not going to let you stay. You're going to get exiled. Let the Fioslin beasts go find their mess by feeding on themselves. This is interesting stuff because very regularly in the medieval period, any kind of perverted sexual activity as defined by the church was often related to bestiality. We had earlier that story about the Minotaur and the woman who wants to make love, so has Daedalus make the wooden shape of a bull, and then she engages in some kind of carnal exchange with a bull to produce the Minotaur and all of that. We have that kind of bestiality happening in the ancient Greek and Roman mythology. Notice here the use of the word beasts to represent these people of Florence who keep feeding on themselves. The second is this notion of cannibalism of a kind, right? Feeding on themselves, and spare the shoot, if any still should grow on their heap of dung, in which the sacred seed, this is what he will consider Dante, the sacred seed is living yet of Romans who remained when Florence went wrong, becoming a nest for the malevolent. This is fascinating because, of course, this nest for the malevolent is speaking directly about the people who are either above this circle or below this circle. In other words, interestingly, Latini says to him, you better look out, my boy. The better you get, the more accomplished you become, the less respect you're going to get from your city. Could I have anything for which I long, you would not still endure this banishment. This is Dante the Pilgrim now. You would not still endure this banishment away from human nature, I replied. In other words, I wish I could do something for you. This is fascinating because Dante the poet has put Latini, without any evidence that we know of, in a circle where great shame is associated with the sexual act of homosexuality. Your image, now we're back to Dante. Your image, Dante the Pilgrim, your image, dear, fatherly, benevolent, being fixed inside my memory, has imbued my heart. By the way, notice the word fatherly, which will take us back to St. Augustine's Confessions and our study with Augustine's Confessions and Augustine's quest to find the true father. He always kind of had a sense that his earthly father was not his real father. Notice here that the word father gets used. By the way, we will come back to this in our study later if you continue to read Purgatorio and Paradiso with some of these observations again. Fatherly, benevolent, being fixed inside my memory, has imbued my heart. When in the fair world, hour by hour, you taught me patiently. It was you who showed the way man makes himself eternal. I just followed your guide, in other words, right? Therefore, the gratitude I feel toward you makes fit that while I live, I should declare it here. Notice the exchange here. It's amazing. We are in hell, in a circle of hell, where people are condemned for their sexual perversions, as it's perceived by the medieval church in Dante. And yet notice the exchange. Nothing about the sexuality at all, but rather about a respect and a warning. Be careful, right? By the way, this is not the first time Dante's been, for Inferno, told him the same thing, right? You better be careful. Okay? And what you tell me of my future, I write. This is, of course, Dante. And keep it with another text as well, till, in other words, what Farinata suggested, till both are glossed by a lady of good wit and knowledge, if I reach her. In other words, when I get to Beatrice, I'm going to ask about what Chaco said, what Farinata said, and of course what you are telling me. This much still I say. So long as conscience is not betrayed, I'm prepared for fortune to do her will. This will be Shakespeare's Hamlet, the readiness is all. In other words, I'm ready for whatever fortune is going to throw at me. My ears find nothing strange in what you've said. As fortune pleases, let her wheel be turned. And as he must, let the peasant turn his spade. In other words, he says, I'm ready for whatever. When he heard these words, my master's head inclined toward the right, and looking at me, he said, "He who has listened well will understand." We immediately think, of course, of the gospel accounts, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear," Matthew 11:15, or the opening lines of Plato's Republic, "How can we hear if we refuse to listen," right? We'll finish now, Canto 15. "And nonetheless I continued as I had in speech with Sir Brunetto. Would he tell which among his companions had enjoyed most eminence and fame in life?" Hey, who are these guys that you're with? Now note the irony, of course. We're in a circle where we're being punished for homosexual behavior. Hey, which of these are most eminent and were most famous in their lifetime? "It is well," he answered, "for me to say the names of some, but nothing of the rest." In other words, I'm only going to name a few of the people that are here. You can imagine if you're a Florentine worrying a little bit about the possibility that somebody in your family might actually be named in this list that's coming. To name them all would demand speaking more words than we have time. In other words, the interesting suggestion is there are a lot more people who engage in homosexual behavior than you would imagine. Back to that line, "I had not thought death had done so many." Here it would be more maybe accorded, "I had not thought that sexual perversion had undone so many," right? All clerics and men of letters, all renowned, and in the world, all stained by this one crime. Now this notion of this one crime, again, Dante, too much of a Christian purist to be able to actually write the word itself or to speak out of it in this way. But everybody understands what's actually going on here. And then he begins to name a couple of names. First we'll have Priscin, who trudges in that unhappy band. Priscin of Caesarea was a 6th century grammarian. As does Francisco Diacroso. Diacroso was a Ghibelline lawyer. He taught at Oxford, he taught at Bologna, kind of famous educator and intellectual. And if you crave to see such scurf among them, you can find one whom the servant of servants, this is Dante the poet jacking on Pope Boniface VIII, who asked to leave